Welcome to Professor Phillip Ayoub's inaugural lecture. It's a good start. Professorial inaugural lectures are an opportunity to celebrate the research and careers of colleagues who have been either newly promoted to or hired as a UCL professor. We've been very fortunate to have a busy series of these lectures throughout last year and this year, and it's been tremendously rewarding to convene and hear about the outstanding work of colleagues old and new. I'm here as head of Department of Political Science to welcome everyone to this event, and then to get swiftly out of the way so that first Professor Sabine Lang can give a proper substantive introduction to Phillip and to his work. Professor Lang is Professor of International and European Studies at the University of Washington. She holds a Jean Monnet Chair in Civil Society, Inclusion, and Diversity from the European Union, and we're fortunate that she's able to be here in person to give this introduction. After her introduction, we'll proceed to Professor Ayoub's talk. After that, Professor Sarah Sohl will give an appreciation. She is the Morgridge Professor of Organizational Behavior at the Stanford Graduate School of Business, and she'll be joining us remotely. Thank you to both Professor Lang and Professor Sohl for joining us today. So finally, once all of that is done, we will head over to the department at 3638 Gordon Square for a drinks reception. You're all welcome there. It is traditional for professorial inaugural lectures to not include a Q&A. We'll be following that tradition today, but Phillip will be over there at the drinks reception like everyone else, and if you really have a burning question, I think he's fair game then. So, as I noted, it's not my role to give a full introduction of Phillip and his work, so I'll give a brief introduction about how he came to join the department and therefore to be here today. Phillip completed his PhD in 2013 at Cornell. He was then an assistant professor at Drexel University in Philadelphia until 2018, was promoted to associate professor, moved to Occidental College in Los Angeles, where he was until 2022. He joined us as a professor that year. So Phillip was one of a large number of colleagues who we hired in the spring of 2021, entirely online in the middle of the pandemic. So that hiring cycle was a sort of transformational event in the history of the department in terms of the number of colleagues we hired, in terms of this opportunity to make all these hires at once and think about the shape of the department. And we were excited and exhausted at the end of that process, looking forward to the wonderful colleagues who would join us in the subsequent years. I think the general consensus for those of us who were there then is that our new colleagues have exceeded our high expectations on arrival, and Phillip is no exception to that. In the year and a half since joining us, Phillip has quickly integrated himself into the intellectual life of the department, as well as made immediate contributions through teaching new modules, contributing to our existing core teaching, and taking on a role as co-director for equality, diversity, and inclusion in the department. There is much more I could say about Phillip's contributions, but that would start to exceed the remit of a welcome and usurp the rightful content of the introduction. So for that, I'm going to hand over to Professor Sabine Lang, who is here to fulfill that role this evening.
Thank you so much, Chair Lauderdale. Can you all hear me all right? Does that work? Great. So it really is a huge pleasure to be here tonight and celebrate the work and the academic life of one of my favorite people in academia, really. Many of you probably here have something to do, are either students or are faculty, and they know that academia at times can be lonely, at times it can be harsh, it's pretty isolating once in a while, and having trusted friends, colleagues, having people you can count on. Would you like me to? So having trusted colleagues is really, really important. And Phil, over the past 2 decades, has become one of those. And by 2 decades, I literally mean 2 decades. I met Phil as an undergraduate. He was the undergraduate. It was my first. It was my first quarter of teaching at the University of Washington in Seattle, and I taught a seminar, I think, on German politics society after 45. And I remember not that much about that class, but I do remember one thing, and that was some internal puzzlement on my side, because there sat this incredibly young-looking person in that class who was very articulate, very smart, very on point with his comments. And I thought, how is that possible? How can that be? Well, you were very young at the time. I think you were by far the youngest student in that class. And, you know, here we are 2 decades later, and out of this relationship that started with teaching came a real good friendship and a collegial and professional interaction that continues. So I would like to really emphasize 3 qualities that I see in Phil and that I've come to cherish over these past decades. And these 3 qualities can be summed up maybe best by articulating that I think he's made a huge contribution to the founding of a field in the social sciences, in political science. Secondly, I think he is what I understand to be a public intellectual, in that he is very keen on extending the reach, which many of you know sometimes is not that far, extending our reach into other aspects of society and politics. And third, I've come to know him as an incredible mentor to his own students and an incredible force in making sure our particular discipline within political science gets seen. So just allow me to have a few moments with each of these qualities. So we already heard Phil got his PhD 2013 and was then on the road to publish his book, his first book, called When States Come Out, Europe's Sexual Minorities and the Politics of Visibility, came out with Cambridge in 2016. And already during that time, it became quite obvious that this book made a huge splash in political science. It got the prize for best dissertation in human rights at the American Political Science Association. It got the prize for best dissertation at the European Union Studies Association. It got the best prize for at Cornell. So already then, a lot of people were paying attention to Phil's work quite extensively. And what I think was really special about this book was that Phil brought out and anchored his work within the broader set of international relations and comparative politics discourse by insisting on the power of what he called the politics of visibility, that impacts how marginalized groups are seen in societies and politics, and the creative venues and ways that they find to articulate their claims. So with his case studies, I think Phil showed us the degree to which international norms and domestic values interact to really form a dimension of visibility that is pertinent to his germane topic, LGBTQ rights, but is also pertinent to other marginalized groups' claims in the broader sense. With this book, I think he established himself in the field of political science, and in order to provide a bit more evidence, I would also like to cite one sentence from one of his other mentors, Sidney Tarrow, who Cornell University, who said, and I quote, that there are many well-trained scholars of social movements, many others who are experts on European transnational politics, and yet many others who specialize on LGBT movements. But there is no one who has encompassed all 3 more elegantly than Phil Ayoub. So, second quick traversing into a area that Phil, I think, excels in, namely his role as a public intellectual, which in the best sense of what that means, what I associate with it, really means that we all try very hard to not keep our research within the confines of our universities and institutions and fields, but that we are trying to get our findings out in the world. And Phil does a very, very good job in building relationships with the Washington Post, with the LA Times. Phil has a way to synchronize his academic endeavors with a broader interest in being out in the world. Related to that, I also think Phil's research displays a lot of courage, a courage that I do think is much needed in this current climate of right-wing mobilization against minority rights, sexual gender minority rights in particular. And I'm really glad we're going to hear tonight about the most recent monograph co-written with Christina Stöckel, a professor in Rome and Innsbruck, called Global Resistances to Sexual Orientation, Gender Identity Rights, coming out with NYU Press this year. And this, in a nutshell, this book for me is also a strong piece of evidence for a lot of courage. I had the pleasure of being at a workshop that Christina and Phil organized at his previous university some time ago, where we did discuss the manuscript, but one other thing I remember is that over dinner at night, stories were circulating about Phil going to Bogota, Colombia, and in a very heated moment where the anti-gender ideology was used to compromise the peace deal between the revolutionaries and the government, and Phil was called in to talk, advise, interact with activists and academics. Christina Stöckel at the same time was trying very hard to get her eyes on field work in Tbilisi, Georgia, in the World Congress of Families. And again, a work of courage there. They were outed within that Congress, and fieldwork was not very easy after that for her and her dissertation peers who, or students. So these are just a few examples that I think are crucial to keep in mind when you see Phil's work, that it is relevant not just within academia, that there is courage there that translates this work. And in this age of disinformation, I'm deeply grateful and optimistic that this work will make a difference over time. Finally, and my third point, is that Phil is really an inspiration. I'm pretty sure there are not just colleagues, there are also young faces, students in this room, and so you have already experienced Phillip Ayoub as a mentor and as somebody who is making sure that the classroom experience is very special. For all of you, I would like to really recommend a 2022 article in Political Science and Politics called Reverse Research Design in the Undergraduate Classroom. An eye-opening piece, I think, for many of us, because in this, Phil shows us how to go backwards with students instead of assigning them tasks that are maybe a little scary and overload, going backwards and taking a published book or an article and putting students in that author's shoes and going back, trying to make decisions that are, as we all know, quite painful sometimes, about data selection, about scope, about ways in which you establish significance. So just a very innovative approach to teaching. And in a recent special issue that I co-edited with Phil and another colleague, Petra Arons from Finland, I could also see that there was one colleague whose contribution was, I think, her first piece in a journal, and Philip took immense care of making sure that this piece turned out with excellence. Sometimes he put a little pressure, but not too much. Oftentimes it was just care and very conscientious mentoring that worked to the students' favor, or former students' favor, and to our favor as co-editors. So Phil really has made a point to encourage young scholars to publish. He, as co-editor of the journal, the European Journal of Politics and Gender, he is trying very hard to globalize a journal that is European-focused, bring new voices in together with his co-editor, Jennifer Piscopo, who might be somewhere in this room too. In all those ways, I think we can be really happy that Phil is in academia. You can be extremely happy he is with you. And I would like to close, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think in that seminar 20 years ago, we did connect over a East German writer named Christa Wolf, who I introduced you to and who is one of my favorites. And so I'd like to close with a very simple quote by Christa Wolf. Writing, she says, is making things large. So Phil, you've done an excellent job, I think, in this quest for gender equality, LGBTQ rights, to make things large for the field, for activists, for colleagues, and make them visible within many spheres of influence. So with this, I think you provide a lot of inspiration for many of us, and I look very much forward to hearing your talk now. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Sabina, for this very generous and moving talk. Ben, thank you so much for the kind welcome. It's such a privilege to be here with you all tonight. I didn't know what an inaugural lecture was until I moved here to the UK in 2022, and I've since got to experience what nice occasions these are by watching some of my colleagues do them. And the fact that I can get to do this also with two cherished mentors, Sabina, who you just met, and Sarah from my graduate committee, who you'll meet later, is such an honor for me. And it's also an honor that so many of you took time out of your Thursday evenings to come here. I do see some of my brilliant students, also some of my co-authors, some of my co-editors, some of my family and friends, and also old and new colleagues. You've all shaped the way I think about politics, and so it's really wonderful to share this room with you on that front. Even though I'm being recognized, or this professorship is in part about my work on LGBT politics, I wanted to actually take a moment to tell you about my path there, which is that I actually didn't apply to graduate school working on that topic. I sent my application to Cornell. It was a project on European Common Foreign and Security Policy, which was a terrible idea for a lot of reasons, not least because I probably wouldn't have finished my dissertation had I done it. But I had actually been involved with LGBT activism before, and I was very inspired by it, even if not fully open about it. I had, as an MA student, was seeing how Berliners and also Polish migrants were organizing buses to go march in Poland, which for me inspired a lot of interesting questions around political science, like what is rational about marching for rights in a context where if you win them, you don't get them? What is driving this kind of solidarity? And also, why does the landscape look so different around, the introduction of LGBT rights in many different countries? And so I did have questions, but I decided to play it safe since I'd never read an article on LGBT people in political science at that point. So I thought it would be maybe not a good bet to get into grad school with a project like that. And I think my concerns were somewhat substantiated when I was finishing my prospectus. Julie Novkov and Scott Barclay had done a survey of the field of political science of the APSA membership, and they noted a lot of apprehension around the study of LGBT politics in our discipline, especially in the field of IR, which was my main field. 25% said of the surveyed faculty said it was not appropriate, and another 20% said they didn't know how. And it's interesting because in 2010 was a time when issues like marriage equality were spreading through the international system in a really rapid rate. So the fact that the question of whether it could be part of international relations seemed to me not to make so much sense. This is changing rapidly in large part thanks to many colleagues in this little field of gender and politics and LGBT politics that are pushing the needle forward and showing how this case can really shape political science, not just, political science in many ways, from the politics of religion to public health to nationalism, human rights, change in opinions. It's a really fruitful case, and we do see it all around us. You know, you see it in the geopolitics of war if you listen to how Vladimir Putin incorporates LGBT people in his discussion of justifying the war. We certainly saw what we could have learned maybe from HIV/AIDS during the COVID pandemic when most of our field ignored that crisis, but it was, of course, a crisis that was exacerbated by political institutions that ignored it and for over a decade. Yet we didn't really go there as a field. We also have in front of us a movement that has shaped public opinion and also rights legislation in really unprecedented speed, potentially more rapidly than any other social justice movement. So there are a lot of, it's low-hanging fruit, I guess, to kind of to think about how it affects what we like to think about in political science. So I did get to grad school and very quickly realized that I did want to switch my topics. Even though most of our journals in the 20th century had not gone there at all, I thought it was worth a try. And I guess it did work out, given that we're here together now, even though I'm a bit surprised by it myself. And I am really grateful to many people who helped me along the way. And I would like to just say a few words of thanks to those folks before, and there's many I'll leave out, but before I turn over to the talk. So Sabina, who you've met, and Sarah, who you'll meet in a moment, have been steadfast supporters of my work. That's why it's so extra special to have them here. My advisors, Peter Katzenstein and Sid Taro, as well as my committee of Matt Evangelista, Chris Anderson, and Sarah, were so patient with me as I tried to attach these relatively bizarre interests to mainstream political science, often with Sarah and Matt vetting those ideas before going to my advisors. They really nurtured me and have continued to really support my work in such tremendous ways. I feel incredibly lucky to have had this committee at Cornell. My graduate student friends, I ended up with a group that was working mainly on race and gender, and they really provided a lot of frameworks for me that I could apply to LGBT rights. And I think I learned a lot from them, and also from professors working on LGBT politics in other fields and at other universities who took the time to read and comment on my work. My family and my partner, despite, I believe, not knowing too much about what I was up to for most of that time, were tremendous sources of support. My mother and sister and brother-in-law and uncle and family are here tonight, which I really appreciate. Also, my father, who I lost a few weeks before my dissertation defense to cancer, was a really endlessly supportive, like many immigrant dads. He was very passionate about the pursuit of knowledge and wanted his kids to do that, and that really gave me a lot of inspiration. I also thank a lot of the activists that made time for me. I talked to a lot of them over the years and continue to. They've shared a lot of expertise with me, and I certainly owe them a major gratitude. I have a few friends that traveled in here tonight: Olga, Blanca, Bjorn, my friend Ludwin also, who I shared an office with in Florence as postdoc, as Max Weber postdocs, have been wonderful supporters. Blanca and Olga have traveled actually to fieldwork sites with me from Bratislava to Budapest to The Hague. Olga did help me with my Polish homework for 3 years after my committee added that to my methods to-do list. Bjorn has taken care of the medical needs of political scientists, actually until last week, as you can see with my forehead. And here in London, I'm really grateful to the Graham Harrisons, who I lodged with for a year when I moved here and have introduced me to everything about British culture and have also created such a smooth landing. And then finally, I'd love to thank my new departmental colleagues at UCL. Thank you for taking a chance on hiring me, and also thank you for centering LGBT work here. I know I could think of really no department that's hired not just one, but actually two, with my colleague Samar Anabtawi, who's here as well. Two people, top political science department that has two people working on LGBT rights is really just wonderful. So thank you for signaling the importance of our work by doing that.
Happy LGBT History Month.
Yes, and happy LGBT History Month. All right. So let me move on to the talk. So tonight, I should actually just put my timer on here as well. So I thought about, I've been curious about different things related to LGBT politics, but I did think it might be useful to go back to the original book and lead into the new book that I have with Christina, which Sabina already mentioned, because they're kind of bookends to a broader question that I've been interested in. Christina and I met in 2014 when I was finishing the first book, which was about how LGBT activists were using transnational tools to really rapidly diffuse LGBT rights provisions in a lot of new surprising places. But we were also noticing how their opposition was increasingly using those transnational tools as well. And Christina is a sociologist of religion, and I had a lot to talk about on this. And we applied for a grant then, and that led to this, 10 years later, to this new book that's coming out. So I thought I would maybe discuss briefly some of the key points of the old book, which was looking at transnational activism and the diffusion of LGBT rights, and asking why some states adopt rights while others don't, and really attributing a lot of that explanation to the transnational activism of these innovative activists. And then the second book, which looks at backlash to those rights globally and asks, how transnational more conservative movements work and and argues that they use similar tools, and they increasingly do so in the last 15 years. So the time I was working on the first book was a really time of interesting change. I mean, there were a lot of surprises that happened between 2007 and 2015. For example, Ireland passed marriage equality by popular vote. Malta, another small Catholic island, would become a leader on trans recognition. These were countries that we hadn't really theorized in the literature that we had on LGBT politics. Indeed, a lot of the earlier explanations were single case studies that focused on domestic explanations or really privileged them. So we would think of, religious cultural contexts, the degree of secularism, how democratic they were. And so you had kind of the usual suspects like the Netherlands or Sweden or Norway that could get these kind of rights. It wasn't explaining the new kinds of states that we saw also adopting these rights. This is actually not my data. I wanted to get something more updated. This is a map from Activist Organization, but you can see there's quite a bit of variation across the European continent on the degree of those rights. And so I made a quite simple argument that states care about their image in their international societies, drawing from international relations theory. But I argued that while there was a norm developing around these rights, so at the European Union there was the first binding international law, for example, Article 19 of the Amsterdam Treaty, that included sexual orientation in workplace protections. While there was these developing norms, we still saw a lot of variation in the degree to which countries adopted them or not. And I argued that norms needed to be made visible, and that the felt intensity of a norm might actually vary quite a bit across states, depending on three international channels. And this is where I wanted to wed some of the findings around domestic explanations, which I continue to think are very important, but also add the international to that to say it's, as Kelly Coleman once put it, it's not a coincidence that so many states adopted so many rights provisions around the same time. There is something international going on here. And so I looked at three kinds of channels, international channels that made states more porous to this norm, and argued that when those channels were more open, that we would get higher rates of LGBT rights. And so one is a social channel. That is kind of the dissemination of ideas and images around queer people. So some people used to call this the Will and Grace effect, which, whatever you think about that show, it did introduce new ways, new kinds of characters across many borders. You also had political openness, which is the degree to which countries were embedded in their international communities. And so you could see states' ability to sanction or persuade being higher in those kind of contexts. And then another kind of channel, which I really privilege and talked a lot about in the book due to my work with activists, was this norm broker channel. It's a mediated channel, and what that looks at are local, so I measured local activist groups that became embedded in transnational advocacy organizations. And I argued that they play two kind of games that make them very important. They're local, and so they know how to graft and frame contentious politics for a given audience, but they're also being able to pull from the transnational advocacy group, from the international, the attention of other states, the sanction of other states onto theirs, and resources and support in a way that could help the cause. And indeed, LGBT rights activists have been organizing transnationally since the 1800s. There's a long history of doing this, a long history of understanding each other across borders, and so this was something that I thought needed to be explored. And there are examples of these kind of transnational advocacy networks like the International Lesbian, Gay, Bi, Trans, and Intersex Association that have been around since the 70s and continue to do this work. And some of this kind of international socialization might be captured in a cartoon like this. Here you see the former German Chancellor Angela Merkel, and she is trying not to catch the bouquet that says marriage equality of an Irish couple, given that they were now getting married in 2015, and Germany had not yet passed marriage equality. But then there was actually pressure even from with her own party and others that said, how embarrassing it is that Germany, which is supposed to be, at the forefront of human rights, has missed the boat on this one. And so she's trying to dodge it. She did eventually catch the bouquet. She released the party whip in 2017. She didn't vote for it herself, but she knew well that it would pass. And so this builds into kind of boomerang and spiral models, which we have in international relations, which predict that when you have a hostile political climate, when your government is not receptive to you, that activists can look outside of the state, they can make connections with international organizations, they can also connect to activist groups in other countries to really put pressure on states to follow new kinds of norms and new kinds of standards. And we see that with many examples I'd be happy to talk to you about in the drinks reception. But there are, this has diffused certain issues to lead us to a status today where many countries have an institution like marriage equality, for example, where it's worth keeping in mind that when we turned into the century, no country in the world had full marriage equality. So it's a very short amount of time that we see institutions in place that many of my students think have been around for a really long time and take for granted, but they haven't. And I also showed, quantitatively in that book, alongside trying to understand the mechanisms with my interviews, I showed that while the domestic explanations mattered a lot for the first mover states, that when we went into the new adopter states, that a lot of these international channels really did a lot of explaining, and it also explained why we had some surprising cases like Slovenia, like Spain, leapfrogging older cases on LGBT rights and getting to higher levels of them. So that leads me to, unfortunately, the more depressing part of the lecture, which is the second book and also the end of the first book, which takes into account that there is a lot of resistance to these rights everywhere, and there always has been. And this is a rainbow arch that used to be on a square in Warsaw, and what's really neat about it is that I think it symbolizes a lot of the struggle that activists, and especially Polish activists who I'm so inspired by, have faced. It was burnt down 6 different times. It was put together again after that, and they're actually little ribbons, so it wasn't easy to rebuild it, but it kind of shows the resilience of these movements. And the thing about LGBT rights, because they deal with gender and sexuality, these are fluid concepts that are really seen as destabilizing to kind of fixed notions of the nation, of religion, and it really provides a platform for elites to stoke threat around these. Often they do it to galvanize, political support, but they're really easily painted as a kind of foreign imposition that is an infringement on domestic sovereignties and values. There's a cartoon that I discovered during my fieldwork in Poland about 15 years ago that I think depicts some of this. It's being sarcastic. It's a conservative cartoon, and it's saying, so they are the fascists, which are kind of normal-looking Poles, and then it says, and these are the Poles, kind of insinuating the new Poles. What you see there, they depict LGBT people kind of with a gay is okay flag, but they also include other international symbols that are becoming unwanted or threatening in the Polish right, including the European Union flag, which is falling out of fashion, is kind of seen as an infringement on state sovereignty. And interestingly, there's also hammer and sickle there, which has not much to do with LGBT rights, but it doesn't really matter. That's the point. It's all bundled together as a threat from the outside that destabilizes the normal way of life. The new book started recognizing the new book with Christina, that a lot of these resistances, which have always existed domestically and locally, and they've taken many different turns domestically, even though this kind of foreign imposition argument exists almost everywhere, whether Poland or Zimbabwe, or it's very similar. But what we started to see, especially after 2009, was that there was also a globalization of this resistance. There was an active coordination across borders. Some of it had started already in the 90s against women's rights and gender ideology, but it increasingly started focusing on LGBT people. And so there you saw a similar pattern, as we saw in the other boomerang and spiral models. You had norm entrepreneur states. Instead of the Netherlands, you got Russia promoting traditional values. You had international organizations like the Catholic Church, and you had transnational advocacy networks like the World Congress of Families that were able to connect across borders and stoke a new kind of proposal, new kind of normative ideas around bills defending religious liberty, or laws challenging so-called gay propaganda, which we see even in the European Union now, or concerns around protecting children from education, dealing with LGBT rights. Those kind of issues started circulating in a very similar way in many different places. Excuse me. And so Christina and I tried to theorize some of that resistance in connection to how LGBT people had organized before. Sabina already mentioned Tbilisi when Christina was there, and I thought that's a really, our team was in many different places, but in 2016, one kind of parallel fieldwork activism, I was in Nicosia at an event called Reclaiming Family Values, which might sound kind of conservative, but it was actually LGBT activists trying to figure out how to take back the family. And so there was a lot of talk about rainbow families and about broadening our scope of how we take care of our children in rainbow families, how we protect children who might be queer, and how we protect children also who have parents that are LGBT. And Christina was in Nicosia on May 1st, which some of you in this room might know as the International Day Against Homo and Transphobia, but in Georgia, by the decree of the Patriarch, it was renamed to Family Day. And they hosted, it was a holiday, Family Day, and they hosted the World Congress of Families, like many countries have in recent years. And there was an event like the Nicosia one, with activists from all over the world coming together. It was opened by a Frenchman who said, this was a couple years after France had marriage equality, and he said that despite the resistance to the majority of our population, the government legalized gay marriage. My dear Georgian friends, resist the gay agenda that wants to destroy your families. And so these events are taking place to talk about how to organize against LGBT rights. And the LGBT activists at Reclaiming Families were talking about how to take the wind out of the sails by reclaiming some of these charges, against them. So that has changed. Basically, we argue that has changed activism on both sides, and that they have to interact with each other. And so we argue that the resistances to LGBT rights have begun to employ many of the same transnational tools that garnered LGBT people their widespread recognition. And we kind of try to reshape the spiral model as kind of a double spiral model, or what we call a double helix, which I'll mention to you in a second. We hope it works well, but we're not sure. We'll see. It's too late now to change it, but do tell me at the Q&A, at the reception if you don't like it. We don't mean it in a biological sense, just kind of in a parallel, but having a field between the two. And then we also argue that these resistances to LGBT rights unite a really interesting group, kind of strange bedfellows when it comes to how ideologically and geographically scattered they are, but they come together around a set of perceived threats that all intersect with gender, and those can be attached to fears around communism, demographic decline, nativist panic, and secularism, but they all deal centrally with LGBT people. Why is this interesting or surprising? Well, it is a bit surprising for international relations. For one, and there's many scholars that have said this surely before us, but this is a field that originally saw a lot of this transnational advocacy working around, progressive causes or quote unquote good human rights. And we really want to show that a lot of these tools are available and effective also to opposing movements. It also, their work also challenges some of the optimism around post-material modernity and cosmopolitan secularism that we had in the field. And then most importantly, our third and fourth points is that the nationalism, or that nationalism, and also that the distinctiveness of different faiths are not as strong of impediments towards this kind of cross-border work and this kind of conservative oikomenism, which means the bringing together of different kinds of faiths. So, and that was a surprise also for me, that I really thought that given that a lot of these folks were very nationalistic, that it'd be hard for them to be so close with people from other nations, but when you have kind of a common focal point, that seems quite possible. And so the structure of that book deals with, kind of trying to sketch out these rival networks, trying to get a closer look at the actors who comprise the moral conservative one, which has been understudied. There's been great works on it in the last 5 or 6 years, but relatively new. And then trying to unpack some of their claims and strategies, as well as how LGBT movements respond. And I will just touch briefly on a few of those points before wrapping up. So, the first point is that there are these rival transnational advocacy networks, and what we'd like to argue theoretically for international relations is that while the older spiral and boomerang models often saw kind of a progressive movement working internationally, and then once they entered the domestic space, they would meet their resistance there, so people would mobilize against them in the domestic space. We're trying to argue that actually they're meeting their resistance at all different levels, including at the UN and at the European Union, various international courts, and also at the national and local level. And so that means that it shapes, a lot of their frames and a lot of the ways that both movements interact, because they have each other in mind, and they have to deal with each other's, interact with each other's claims. And so they have, in a way, a bit of a reciprocal relationship. Next, we tried to just chart who some of these main actors are in the moral conservative movement. There's many groups that link activists across borders. The one that we look at the most is the International Organization for the Family, which is arguably the most active. They organize these World Congress of Families events. It has a strong kind of connection to the US, but is very embedded in Russia and in other countries around the world. I'll show you a bit of a network analysis of that in a moment. There's also groups like Citizen Go, which is a digital platform. It's a Spanish platform, but now operates in multiple different languages across 17 linguistic contexts, and also has 12 million subscribers. And they work also to really target LGBT rights, along with a lot of other kinds of organizations, from homeschooling to other groups. Sorry. And then there are states and IOs that really champion this work, where I think one of the most quintessential ones in this moment has been Vladimir Putin's kind of traditional values paradigm, where he's presented the Russian state as defending nations from kind of decadent Western values, but there are a lot of other states that also do this work. I know that you can't see much in these figures, but just the point being that there's a lot of this shows kind of both countries that host these World Congress of Families events, as well as where participants are coming from. And so you do see there is a really global reach of this movement. This shows countries voting in favor of moral conservative resolutions. So that would mean that kind of more anti-LGBT resolutions. The green countries are the ones in favor. But what is interesting is that also countries that we might consider as more LGBT friendly house a lot of civil society groups that actually support the moral conservative resolutions at the UN. So it's much more complex than kind of gay friendly or LGBT friendly and not kind of states. There's a lot of interaction across them. Oops. And the makeup of these groups, this is also very hard to read, but you can see this shows the ones at the bottom attend, the groups that attend these events the most frequently. You can see the US, Nigeria, Venezuela, so you already see 3 continents represented, right at the beginning, and then these are various actors. You see the US and Russia housing a lot of these groups, but also many other countries around the world are really active in, groups in many countries are active in this kind of work. And the claims that are really, that are being brought forward by these groups have a lot to do with so-called gender ideology. This is, to quote a famous definition now by David Paternaut and Roman Couar, this is the view of gender as an ideological matrix of unwanted social reforms, namely sexual and reproductive rights, same-sex marriage and adoption, new reproductive technologies, sex education, gender mainstreaming, protection against gender violence, and very centrally lately also transgender inclusion, so opposing all of these things. And they stitch together what we call in the book a moral conservative narrative, which is really kind of hard and frustrating to piece together because the logic holds a lot of contradictions, but nonetheless, it is very well, is very mobilizing and very, people are very passionate about it in many parts of the world. And it leads, these are a few, it leads to kind of concerted efforts to oppose LGBT rights. So here's, for example, a petition in German from Citizen Go, but this existed then in many other countries as well. So it says to stop the LGBTQ indoctrination through LEGO, and so it's a petition against LEGO. This is an attempt, and actually activists said that they wanted to have their own rainbow flag, basically, and so this is the Natural Families flag, which comes in pink or blue. And then the fact that this is happening, and I realize I'm going through 9 chapters of a book in like 10 minutes, but we also did some content analysis of how this reshapes the work the LGBT groups are doing. What is really interesting is that it shows that the LGBT movement has also changed a lot of the way that it functions and talks in response to this other movement. And so we see that the movement has developed a new framing to try to counter arguments that they are foreign imposition, and also to try to counter arguments that they're threats to families and children. And the way that this is done, maybe somewhat surprisingly, if you are familiar with the kind of universal human rights frames that LGBT groups used in the 90s or early 2000s, is that oftentimes now they talk more in kind of rooted, national, family-focused, or even religious language. So you can have pride parades called Love Thy Neighbor, or you can, the Polish KPH, the group used to have kind of European Union-looking stars in its logo, and now has the borders of the Polish state. There are little kind of ways to kind of signal that these groups are indigenous nationally as well, which has been important to them. And this is a campaign from 2016 called Let Us Show Each Other a Sign of Peace. It's a Polish campaign that LGBT activists and some Catholic groups, not sanctioned by the Catholic Church, but Catholic groups worked with to kind of also center faith-based queer communities and show that they exist. It also is what you say to each other in Mass, in Catholic Mass. And it's also resonant because Polish bishops wrote German bishops in 1965 a letter that said, let us show each other a sign of peace, which was to kind of signal, let's reconcile after the Second World War. And so it is a resonant phrase in Poland. There's also been attempts to basically center children. This is one from the Irish Yes campaign, which was around marriage equality. And their opposition, which was much better funded, had these posters everywhere with a stock family image saying that children deserve a mother and a father. But then that family found out that they were being used in these flyers. They actually volunteered their services to a Children Deserve Equality campaign to vote yes. And so you show also the ways that family and children have become more centered. I'm not going to dwell on this, but we did a lot of interviews both with moral conservative activists and LGBT activists to try to stitch together parts of this argument in the last years. I want to just sit on the last slide for a minute before I turn, before I stop talking at you, but to kind of think about a few takeaways that I think apply to these books, but also to other articles and projects that I've been working on for the last, I guess, last 15 years or so. And I think that one of the main points is that LGBT rights are still really actively challenged. I think the second book really emphasizes that as well, but it is a continuing struggle in many, many places, the degree to which LGBT rights are an ongoing battle. This is not a kind of the rights we have won type story, but there's a really long way to go. And that it connects to a second takeaway point, which is that how these rights that we have won are used, and also who is left out, is really an important, important part of my research, including work I did with Sabina on intersectional coalitions in LGBT movements. We see a lot of patterns, a lot of intersections around race, gender, class, ability that really also play out in LGBT movements. A lot of the rights we have won affect upper middle class white gay men in different ways than they affect other communities in the LGBT umbrella. I think most vividly we see attacks on trans communities, the United Kingdom being one of the most aggressive places for transphobia in the world. The United States also not far behind. There are 400 active bills in US states right now on the transphobic bills tracker that are being counted as currently active that groups are trying to pass. So we really have to think about this issue intersectionally. And then also we have to think about how these rights are used when they're there. And this leads to important insights from queer theory around homonationalism, for example. And so LGBT rights are suddenly also being used to preclude other kinds of human rights. So we see arguments by right-wing parties that want to protect our gays and lesbians and use those rights to limit migrants' human rights who are painted as a threat. Or we can see now also in this moment, tanks with rainbow flags claiming to liberate areas of the world that are seen as, are painted as homophobic and dangerous, and just used then to justify military intervention. These are not, core tenets of LGBT rights mobilization. This is not where activists saw all of this going, and these are things that I think we have to really guard against, keep in mind as we think about the rights we have won in this really exciting movement that has revolutionized the way a lot of people live their lives in different countries around the world. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much for your attention. I think now I will turn it over to Sarah, if you're there. Hi, Sarah.
It's lovely to be here, and thank you for that great lecture. Phil, it was really wonderful to hear more about this new book, and I can't wait to see it when it comes out. It is such an honor to have been asked to express a few words about Phil, whose work we just had the pleasure of learning more about. And I want to begin by saying that just as Sabine expressed, Phil is one of my favorite people in academia too. And Sabine did a great job of talking about these three facets of Phil's research that have made his work so important. And I especially like Sid Caro's remark about what makes Phil's research so important, because he's contributed to the development of
I'm so sorry, Sarah. It's just a little bit quiet. I'm just going to ask if the tech people can help us here. It shows that it's already up all the way, the volume.
Do you have the transcription?
All right, Sarah, I think your captions are on now. We can see you better, which is great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, I'm going to start over then, because I think it's really important to just, for everybody to hear the full words of appreciation, and to know that I feel so honored to have been asked to do this. So, Sabine already said that Phil is one of her favorite people in academia, and she did a great job about talking about these three facets of Phil's work that have made it so impactful, including what Sid said about how Phil has contributed to the development of this and dedicated scholar, and also mentor. And I think this also might help us understand why I bet so many of us in the room would describe him as one of our favorite people in academia. So I wanted to just highlight 3 characteristics of Phil as a human being. And I'll begin by saying, echoing really what Sabine said. Sabine said that when she first met Phil, she thought he may be just too young to ask such insightful questions and personas. And echoing this, I've always felt that Phil is wise beyond his years. And when I was reflecting on how this could be and why this happens, I think that this has to do with his incredible curiosity. Now, lots of us academics, of course, are curious. In fact, I think this should be part of a job description to be an academic. But I want to emphasize that Phil is curious about others. Now, this curiosity manifests itself, of course, in asking good questions, which is great. Actually, there's an art to asking good questions, and Phil asks really good questions. But he's also terrifically empathetic and perceptive about others. So when you're with Phil, and many of you in the room know this, you feel like you might just be the most important person in the world. You feel heard, you feel seen, and this is such a gift that Phil has. Being curious and empathetic probably helps and probably contributes to this observation that Phil has always been wise beyond his years. So curiosity is really important. I think the second attribute of Phil's character is generosity. Now, I think, Sabine mentioned that one of the facets of Phil as a researcher and an academic is, of course, being an excellent mentor. But I think this generosity goes beyond this. Of course, Phil always will offer to provide feedback on papers and ideas, of course. But he's also the first person to connect people to those that they need to be connected to for whatever reason. And I think really importantly, lots of people connect people, but not everybody connects people without extracting rents from being broken. And so whether or not he is connecting friends to other friends, scholars to other scholars, activists to other activists, he does this because he knows instinctively that this is going to lift the community. And so that's, I think, part of Phil's generosity is his ability to elevate a community. And of course, that makes him such an inclusive scholar, such a good friend, and also what will contribute to him as an academic leader at UCL as well. And then finally, I think the third aspect that I wanted to highlight of Phil's character that makes him so special is his open-hearted optimism. So for those of us who know his research deeply, we know that he approaches his topics with an open heart. Phil indicated this actually in his opening remarks when he talked about his desire to switch his research stream almost as soon as he started his graduate studies at Cornell. And you also heard this echoed in his talk today. I don't think Phil could study the things that he studies without some degree of open-hearted optimism, but he brings this throughout all of the papers and the books that he has contributed to. I'll also know that, and many of us who have collaborated with Phil or mentored Phil or been in any kind of even just a conference proceeding with Phil, it's infectious. So that when you're around Phil, when he's talking about his research, you feel inspired to embrace your own research, and also to do this with gusto, and I dare say also with love. Phil loves his topics, and he inspires others to love his topics as well. So, just in conclusion, I'm fairly confident that everybody who is there and has known Phil for a long time, such as his family members that are there, his friends that are there, and those of us who are getting to know him professionally at UCL, I think you'll agree with my description of Phil as a human being, curious, generous, and full of open-hearted optimism. And I'll also urge those of you who maybe don't know Phil as well to invest in getting to know him. You know that academia is often lonely, and I'll add that academics often suffer from feeling invisible and insignificant. But will never feel lonely and never feel invisible. And that's what makes Phil so special. Congratulations, Phil. Your lecture was wonderful, and I'm so happy to have been part of it.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming today. We're going to adjourn now and move over to the department, 36 to 38 Gordon Square, where we're set up for the drinks reception. I want to thank again our guests from Phil's Transnational Network of Appreciators, which I'm sure goes well beyond everyone who's here. Thank you so much for the introduction. Thank you for the appreciation as well. And thank you all for coming.